Hi! In today's video, I'm going to be talking about how I travel anywhere for $2,000 or less. I made a video not that long ago talking about a Thailand budget. I spent just under $2,000 for being there 3 weeks. And since going to Thailand, I have also traveled to Morocco, Costa Rica, Mexico, and the Philippines. And all of those trips have also been in that same $2,000 or less budget. That's kind of my magic number, the amount that I'm willing to spend on a trip. I don't really like to go that much over that. And I've been successful so far on all of those different countries, different parts of the world, being able to stick to that same $2,000 budget. I just want to say that this is US dollars, and that is obviously a huge factor of why I'm able to travel for this amount of money, because the US currency is pretty strong compared to a lot of other countries, particularly third world countries, and those are still amazing countries to travel to. To talk about the budget of $2,000, I'm actually going to go through a sample itinerary and budget that I've created. I have a list that is miles long of about 20 different countries where I have a bulleted itinerary of places I'd like to go in certain countries and how much it'll all cost. And I'm going to be going through a sample budget of less than $2,000 for 2 weeks in Peru. The $2,000 number typically gets me 2 weeks in another country. In the example of traveling from America to Peru for 2 weeks, I always start with the plane cost because that's something that is difficult to negotiate. It always is the largest cost. Every time I've gone somewhere, the biggest cost of the entire trip is always the plane. I've given up on any thought of getting a direct flight or having a flight at a nice time of day because I'm okay with a cheap flight. I've flown Spirit before, which is notoriously one of the worst airlines, has some of the worst reviews, and actually I had no issues. It wasn't exactly a luxury flight, but a $2,000 trip is not a luxury trip. So neither is your plane ride. And I checked on the cost for a trip to Peru in high season. That's another thing that always varies, is when you want to go to a certain country. I've typically traveled to all of those countries I listed earlier during their high season because there's a reason why people don't want to go to Thailand in the rainy season or to Morocco in the middle of their summer, just because it wouldn't be as enjoyable. So to go to Peru in July would be a really great time to go because the weather is nice, and the flight that I decided on was $610 round trip. There is a couple hour layover both there and back. One of the flight sites that I like the most for finding good prices is Momondo. I also like Google Flights, and I refer to it a lot, often as a starting point. Definitely check out some different flight searching sites to try and find the best option. The next thing I like to look into is accommodation, and I will spend plenty of time on Booking.com and Airbnb. I also have had good experiences with Agoda, but I typically would only use that for Asia. So for accommodation, you're going to need to decide which cities in the country you want to stay in. And this is another thing that really depends on the currency of the destination country. For example, I have a sample itinerary for Turkey, and I can't get it under $2,000 because I really want to visit Istanbul and Cappadocia and the Turquoise Coast. I know that if I change my itinerary to take out the Turquoise Coast or to take out Cappadocia, I could make that itinerary under $2,000. So you kind of have to realize the size of the country and how much it will be to travel domestically within the country if things are just a short bus ride away to go from one city to the next, or like the Turkey example, things are a plane ride away. So almost all of the time you're going to start your trip in the city that you fly into in this case would be Lima, Peru. My itinerary has me staying in Lima for 3 nights. I actually end up going back to Lima at the end of the trip to fly out of the country again. But for the first 3 nights, I searched on Airbnb and found a lot of amazing options, and I found one of them that would cost $57 for that 3-night period. I believe that this trip would still be under $2,000 if you were traveling solo. However, I typically travel with my boyfriend and we split the cost of any accommodation, which is super nice. So if you have a travel buddy, that's a really great way to save money. So instead of that being $57 for the first 3 nights to stay in Lima, it'll actually end up just costing me personally $29. After that, I knew I wanted to travel to Ollantaytambo. Everyone wants to go to Machu Picchu, obviously, when you travel to Peru, and you can stay in one of the neighboring cities that is pretty close to Machu Picchu. I happened to pick Ollantaytambo, and in this case I stayed there for, again, 3 nights. There was not as much to choose from on different booking accommodation sites in that city, so I ended up having to go with one that would cost $103. I find in general that bigger cities like Lima have a lot more choice and you can find a lot cheaper options compared to smaller areas that just don't have as much on the market, so they're able to raise their prices. But even still, after splitting that cost, for 3 nights it would cost me $51. After Ollantaytambo, I wanted to go to Cusco. I wanted to be there for 6 nights, which sounds like a lot, but Cusco is a pretty big city. There's a lot to do there, as well as in the surrounding areas of Cusco. I have a good number of ideas of what I could do there, and like I mentioned, because Cusco is a larger city, there was a lot of choice options on Airbnb. I found a nice looking one that would cost $121 for 6 nights. Splitting that in half would be $61 about. And then for the last 2 days of my trip would be again back to Lima, and the final day being flying home, so I didn't have an accommodation cost for that day. And those final 2 nights in Lima, I found a really great Airbnb that would cost $40 for 2 nights, so my share would be $20. And all in all, that comes to an accommodation cost of $200 just for me personally. But I just want to say, even if you stayed in the exact same places that I did as a single person, and your accommodation cost ended up being $400 rather than $200, you would still be at the $2,000 mark in this budget. Although one advantage of being a single traveler is that you have the opportunity to stay in Airbnbs that only have a single bed, or in a hostel where you don't have to have a private room, but hostels are definitely the cheapest accommodation of all. The next part of my budget that I want to talk about is food. This is a really easy way to cut back and keep your budget costs low, because sure, you can go to the fancy restaurants and splash out a couple of times, but in general, I really find that the food experience in other countries is the best when you're eating in places that are not that expensive and just places that the locals would go to, rather than the places that are packed with tourists, because they typically hike the price up on those places because they know that American and European tourists will pay more. So in this particular case, I budgeted about $24 a day, which comes out to $325 total for the food budget. $24 a day might not seem like very much, but I actually looked up a couple of example restaurants and was able to find menus down in these different cities, which is a really good trick to see how much food costs in a particular city. And I saw that there were plenty of meals that would be like $8 or $9 US, so I think that a $24 a day budget for food is plenty. The next part of the budget I want to talk about is transportation, getting from city to city, and then also getting to certain sites and attractions from the cities that you're in. So I actually looked into how to get from Lima to Ollantaytambo, which would be actually to go from Lima and get a flight to Cusco and then take a colectivo to Ollantaytambo, and that's the first kind of major transportation in my trip. So a flight from Lima to Cusco is $75, and a colectivo is about $10 from the research that I did online. A colectivo is much like a taxi. I've ridden them in Mexico and I think in Costa Rica as well. Then another transportation part of the trip would be going from Ollantaytambo to Machu Picchu. And of course there is an official train to get to Machu Picchu, and a round trip ticket is $145, which is more than a flight from Lima to Cusco, but obviously Machu Picchu is something that I really wanted to center this example trip around, because I know that going to Peru without Machu Picchu is not very common for most tourists. And then it doesn't even take you quite all the way to Machu Picchu. You have to pay for another $25 bus to get directly there, unless you want to hike uphill. I read a little bit into it and I just figured we could take the bus. I have room for it in the budget. And then the very last thing on my list of transportation is taxi costs, because I do a lot of walking when I'm in other countries, but I wanted to make sure to include the option for taking taxis, so I tacked on an extra $150 in taxis, including a taxi that could get you to the airport at the end of your trip, or take you to your first accommodation place at the beginning of your trip from the airport. Airport taxis are always the biggest ripoff, but they're really hard to avoid. Most other taxis within city limits are much more affordable in countries that are generally cheap on the US dollar. I found most taxi rides in Morocco, Costa Rica, what I looked up for Peru, the Philippines, to just be a couple of dollars, unless you're going like more than an hour away. So in total, that makes the transportation cost $400, which typically is a little high for what I have spent on past trips, but the reason for that is the $145 train cost for Machu Picchu. Then that brings us to the last bucket in the budget, which is activities. This obviously varies a ton based on what you're interested in doing, but I wanted to just look at a couple of typical ideas that people would be interested in doing in Lima, in Cusco, obviously going to Machu Picchu, which the entrance fee is actually only $50. I didn't think that was that bad at all. There's also a really amazing ticket option that I found in Cusco where you pay $40 and it gives you access to a ton of different entrance fees in the surrounding area of Cusco, to lots of different ruins and just really cool sights to see and places to walk around, and I thought that was a great deal. In Lima, some of the options would be to go surfing. I know there's a popular sea lion area off the coast that a lot of people like to get a boat to travel to that, and you can swim with sea lions, I think. Taking a dance class. I didn't want to plan this too in-depth because I do like to have some flexibility of seeing a fun thing and spontaneously choosing to do it, but typically I find that those things aren't particularly expensive. I just wanted to include a couple of costs that I knew what they were by looking up how much they would be on either Airbnb, because they have some good activities along with accommodation, of course, as well as on the official Machu Picchu website. But all in all, I decided to give $200 for activities, and I think that would be more than enough. The last cost that I always like to add to any budget that I plan is emergency. I always just tack on an extra $100 for anything that might come up. It might be more than $100, maybe nothing will come up, but I like to have that extra room just in case something happens, just in case something turns out to be more expensive than you thought or that research suggested. So all in all, the entire total of the trip is $1,800, so actually definitely under $2,000. I think the biggest thing to take away about being able to travel on a budget to other countries is by picking the country that you're going to travel to based on currency and the strength of currency, because I don't know if I would be able to come up with a $2,000 trip to go to Switzerland. Another factor though is actually time. So maybe you can go to Switzerland for $2,000, but you can only be there for 8 days rather than 14. Obviously, 14 is ideal, but if you have a really hard budget number, then allow your time in that country to be dictated by that. I'm always okay with tacking on an extra day or taking off a day in order to meet that $2,000 budget. I have a ton of other itineraries like this. I'd be happy to talk about budgets and itineraries from other countries that I've traveled to aside from Thailand, since I did make that video already, so I'll have that in the description if you're interested in watching it. I hope that this video helped in planning out a trip and budgeting out costs of that trip in order to make it work for you. I know that the $2,000 number won't work for everyone, but I do think that it's pretty reasonable for someone like myself who I would not say is well off, but I'm certainly not at the poverty line either. I really feel like I'm just regular, middle of the road, making about the same as most other people my age. But if you have more money to add on, then amazing. And if you have less, then I think a good tactic would be to travel for shorter periods of time. Like instead of going for places for 2 weeks, maybe just stick to 1 week, and that can definitely cut down on costs. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.